Demon's Souls is one of the most influential games of the 21st century. It shunned conventional game design philosophies in favor of bold, original ideas to create an experience unlike anything else that existed at the time. It was the genesis of a formula that has since spiraled into one of the most popular genres in gaming, thanks to its cryptic storytelling, brutal difficulty, asynchronous multiplayer, among many other things. There are so many fascinating design ideas in Demon's Souls that have been around for so long at this point that we kind of just taken them for granted. And most of what Demon's Souls brought to the table has been revised and expanded on over and over again in From Software's other games. But there's one prominent feature, one of Demon's Souls' most defining systems, that has never been revisited. Of course, I'm talking about the tendency systems. It's possibly the most divisive aspect of Demon's Souls, and have been the subject of intense debates within the community pretty much since the game launched. With how notorious the tendency systems are, I was sure there would be at least a few rants or critiques focused on it, so I was quite surprised when nothing of the sort came up while searching through YouTube. So I thought it would be interesting to do a deep dive into the tendency mechanics of Demon's Souls from a more critical angle. I want to break down everything and discuss in detail what they get right, and where these mechanics falter, and how I think they could have and should have been implemented better. I'm making this video with the general assumption that anyone watching has some Demon's Souls experience, but I will be explaining how all of these systems work, since it will provide an important baseline to refer back to later. So with all that out of the way, let's begin. Since there are multiple tendency systems in the game, I'm sure some of you might be asking, well, which one am I going to start with? Well, I'm going to be tackling character tendency first because I feel like it's the easiest one to fully explain, and it will provide some important context for some of the topics I'll be discussing later on. So, let's jump right into character tendency. Your character's tendency in Demon's Souls reflects the moral standing of the player character. It acts as a sort of karma system where your tendency will move towards white, aka good tendency, whenever you perform heroic actions, and it will move towards black, or evil tendency, when you commit acts of evil. Fighting off hostile invaders and killing special black phantoms will push your character towards white tendency, while invading other players and killing friendly NPCs will push you towards black. Pretty simple, right? But your character tendency isn't just for show, it has some pretty substantial gameplay implications as well. Your attack power, both as a blue phantom and as an invader, can be affected by how strong your tendency is in the corresponding direction. The damage you deal in soul form is moderately increased in pure white tendency, and there's even an entire NPC questline exclusive to pure black tendency. Though the game never outright explains much about it, it's something players can gradually gain an understanding of as they play. You see this little symbol in the top left of the screen? It starts out as a mix of black and white, and will gradually brighten or darken as tendency events get triggered. It's the kind of subtle detail meant to clue players in that their actions are having some sort of effect, even if it's not immediately clear what those consequences are. The change in color whenever you trigger a tendency event is immediate and noticeable, and that's very key when players are new to the game and trying to figure things out for the first time. Take note of this for later. The remake also introduced a short tutorial section in the menus that provides a basic rundown of how character tendency works and how it shifts based on the player's actions. In many ways, this system isn't so different from how many things are taught to players in Souls games. The game provides a very basic information on a topic, and it's expected that players will naturally figure the rest out on their own just by interacting with the world and progressing through the game. It helps that what the game considers to be good or bad actions is fairly intuitive. Killing friendly strangers for no reason is something that is generally frowned upon. On the other hand, defeating power-hungry and corrupted dark spirits is exactly what you would expect a morally righteous character to be doing. It's through this intuitive design that players can develop an understanding of how their actions affect their character tendency and the subsequent effect that has on the gameplay. Prolific invaders will start to notice over time that they're killing their targets in fewer and fewer hits, while blue phantoms will also find that they're having an easier time defending their hosts regardless of just being better at the game. Most people won't pick up on every single detail on a first playthrough, or maybe they won't notice at all. But the effects of character tendency will still occur regardless, and will play a role in shaping their overall experiences. Of course, that's outside of the NPC quest, which requires a few more specific conditions to be met. The whole idea of having a karma system that is kind of hidden and that players are forced to figure out for themselves is very cool. Of course, there's no karma meters in real life that tell us how good or bad we are, but our actions do still have consequences, even if we might not notice right away. And I think this system does a good job at making players question things a little bit by infusing the world of Demon Souls with a morality system that in some ways reflects how we think in real life. Many players don't expect stuff like this to exist in video games, and especially not games like this. They'll expect a fantasy RPG to be like Skyrim, where you can run around killing anyone you want to just for fun without any consequences. Demon Souls, though, is a serious game, and it's systems like this that really help to drive that home. The tendency systems often get a lot of flack for how convoluted they are, but I feel like character tendency as is a clever idea that, at least in the remake, gives enough information at the outset that attentive players will be able to figure out the basis of it for themselves. Limiting its effects to only a small number of gameplay aspects, being PvP, soul form stats, and one NPC questline, keep the mechanic focused enough to not be too overwhelming to wrap one's head around. Now it's time for the really big one, world tendency. I feel like it's basically impossible to have a conversation about Demon Souls without at least mentioning world tendency at some point. Some love it, some despise it, and some may go through the entire game without even knowing that it exists. But regardless, the reason I wanted to tackle character tendency first was because it's a lot more straightforward and hopefully serves to outline the general idea of how tendency systems work in this game before diving into this much more complicated version. Much like character tendency, world tendency ranges from pure white to pure black, but instead of just affecting your character, world tendency, as its name kind of implies, has a significant number of effects on the game world at large. Also, while character tendency is consistent for your character throughout the game, world tendency is unique to each of the 5 worlds. So you could have one world in pure white, another in pure black, and the other 3 being somewhere in the middle. The more a world leans towards pure white, enemies will become weaker and easier to kill, while black tendency increases the difficulty of enemies but increases item drops and earns you more souls per kill as a way to balance all of that out. But that's not all either. Unique world events will start to materialize at various stages of world tendency, offering unique opportunities for players to acquire special items, explore new areas, and meet new NPCs that would be impossible to find otherwise. Now, this is all great in theory. It's a more expansive form of the tendency idea that encourages players to fully explore the worlds and even play through the game multiple times to see what mysteries could await under different tendency conditions. But as I've been hinting throughout this segment, the community's reception towards the system isn't exactly unanimously positive. In fact, it's probably the most common complaint that gets leveled at Demon Souls full stop. That's why I'm going to be running through each of these various mechanics of world tendency in quite substantial detail, from the intriguing idea to its more complicated execution. So let's start with the most important thing. World tendency affects a lot of different things in Demon Souls. I already alluded to some of what it does, but I want to go into more details here, just so it's very clear to the full extent of what I'm talking about. So let's talk about white tendency and its associated events. Number 1. Each world has a unique NPC that spawns somewhere in the world upon reaching pure white. They'll have some unique dialogue and often have a short quest you can complete to get some gear, and if you're feeling extra sadistic, you can even kill them to significantly darken both your character and world tendencies. Number 2. Side areas that are normally inaccessible will now open up and become explorable zones. Number 3. The damage dealt by the player in soul form as well as a blue phantom will increase gradually as world tendency brightens, peaking at an impressive 20% bonus at pure white. Ceramic coins will also spawn, but I'm not going to be talking about those too much here, since it's for something very niche and potentially better suited for another time. As for how you manipulate world tendency towards white, killing bosses is the most common way to get there, with 2 boss kills in Worlds 2 through 5 and 3 boss kills in World 1 to go from neutral to pure white. And it's more bosses in World 1 since there are more bosses to be killed and it's a much longer world. Killing player invaders can also be used to push tendency toward white, though of course that requires being in human form. So that more or less covers how white tendency works, and let's move on to black tendency. So remember how I said that NPCs spawn on pure white tendency in each world? Well, in pure black tendency, those same NPCs will appear, but they'll be as hostile black phantoms who will attack you on sight. It's interesting to note that killing their black phantom counterparts does not preclude the normal versions of these NPCs from spawning, so if you were able to take tendency from pure black up to pure white, you could still have a casual chat with them, but they won't talk about you killing their evil double for some reason. Primeval demons will spawn shortly just before hitting pure black. They act as a unique enemy type that drops special upgrade materials when killed, and will also reset world tendency back to neutral while doing so. Number 3, as you push further into black tendency, black phantom variants of normal enemies will start spawning in the world. They'll make the levels much more difficult as they'll often have massive health pools and very high damage. Number 4, new difficulty modifiers to reflect the decaying state of the world are introduced. Enemy damage gets increased up to an insane 50% at pure black. And enemies will also drop more souls when killed, and rare loot will drop more often as a way to balance out the additional challenges faced within the levels. Number 5 is once again, much like pure white, there's some ceramic coins that will appear, but I'm not really going to be talking about those here. And finally, the only other unique world event for black tendency is the Executioner's Ground opens up, which is the same that happens under pure white tendency. And exclusively to the remake, there is a unique ring that appears in 3.2 exclusive to pure black. Okay, so that's everything regarding pure black. There's a little bit more to it, clearly, than there is to pure white. So how do you push world tendency towards black? Well, the most common method of doing so is dying. Dying in human form specifically. If that sounds like it could be problematic, well, yeah, trust me, we'll come back to this later. But okay, that is everything regarding both world tendency states. I hope everyone was able to keep up with all of that. Keep in mind, I haven't actually critiqued anything yet. I just wanted to outline how everything works in detail first, since even players who are familiar with Demon Souls will often lack a complete understanding of world tendency, and I think it's really important for this analysis that everyone is on a level playing field before we dive into the more critical elements. Given just how long it took me to explain all of the different world tendencies and their effects, hopefully you can understand why that is. And if any of that may have sounded condescending, just know that I had to do a ton of research to prepare for this video, and that's already after playing through the game more than 5 times on my own. Even still, I'm still not 100% confident in all of my information, so please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but with that being said, let's start breaking all of these different elements down. If you were able to take anything away from the last several minutes, I hope it would be just how this system underpins a huge amount of the game's content, and it can have a major impact on a player's experience as a result. With that in mind, you might expect that the game would avail players to this important information, so they could experience the game to its fullest potential, but unfortunately Demon Souls makes it extremely difficult and convoluted to figure out what world tendency even is, not to mention how it works, to the point where even experienced players can finish the game several times over without understanding numerous of its implications. Having complex mechanics shrouded in mystery is not inherently a bad thing. It actually serves as great incentive for players to revisit the game multiple times when these kinds of things are handled well. However, given how all-encompassing world tendencies effects can be, I would argue that the game's failure to facilitate even a basic understanding of its mechanics for new players is a fundamental problem, and ultimately the biggest reason this mechanic is so controversial. From's games generally do a good job of nudging players in the right direction when it comes to stuff like this, which is why it doesn't need heavy-handed tutorials most of the time. It often results in players figuring things out in a way that makes for those special kind of light bulb moments where all the pieces fall into place, and that's when it's done well. For example, players' first encounters with patches should teach them a very valuable lesson about NPCs and that they can't all be taken at face value. Players who take that lesson into account will be far less likely to avoid a potentially disastrous situation with Yurt further down the line. There's no tutorial for this, it's simply something that's expected that you'll learn via the interaction with patches. Another example would be that the game doesn't outright tell you need to look for shortcuts to cut down on running, but 1.1 trains you to be on the lookout for these things within the levels by putting the first one in a fairly obvious spot and giving one of the game's best rings there for good measure. You can see right away as soon as you open up this gate and realize exactly where you are just how much you've effectively skipped, and that your journey through the level will now be much easier as a result of doing that extra bit of exploration. Demon's Souls very clearly shows the value of these sorts of soft checkpoints, and players will develop an understanding that they need to actively be looking for these things in subsequent levels in order to make their traversals much easier. The same idea exists with the various traps throughout the game. Let's take a look at the first trap most players will encounter. The boulder at the top of the stairs here won't kill you, it doesn't even deal that much damage, and it even gives you an extra second to react before it starts to roll towards you, but it's an important lesson in paying attention to your surroundings, and that failing to do so can result in a pretty bad situation. This is reinforced later with a trap that is similar but can absolutely get you killed if you aren't careful. This time there's many boulders in addition to a contingent of archers firing down on you at the same time. But if you are able to notice this hazard in time, it can actually be exploited to kill the archers and allow you to pass through the area easily and unimpeded. But fail to heed the game's early lessons and you'll quickly find yourself back at the start of the level after being crushed under the mound of boulders. I could pile on more and more examples, but I think I've made my point by now. There's a fair debate to be had, I think, about how obscure Souls games are in general with certain things, but in regards to essential gameplay systems, Demon's Souls communicates its lessons organically through gameplay without the need for heavy narrative context or lengthy tutorials, and it does so quite well for the most part. Its design philosophy is a big part of what makes the way these games condition players so unique. So why is it suddenly a problem when world tendency comes around and is equally as obscure and vague with its explanations? Well, there's 4 main reasons for this, and this is going to be pretty long, but we're going to be going into all of them in detail. Reason number 1, it's too damn complicated. It touches on way too many different aspects of the Demon's Souls experience that even the most attentive players will have an extremely difficult time developing a proper understanding of what the system even is. This isn't just a single mechanic that a player will gradually become more and more familiar with as they play, able to take the lessons from one instance and bring it into the next one. It affects so many things: difficulty, soul form stats, online multiplayer, item drop rates, soul acquisition rates, world events, and sometimes it can have a ripple effect on character tendency, which has implications all on its own. And all of this is happening largely in the background with little to no direction or indication that it's even happening. While I understand the mystery is part of what makes a system like this appealing in the first place, I would argue that something that touches on so many different aspects of a player's experience is something that they should be at least made aware of, right? So how are players meant to understand all of this? This is a case where a nice helpful tutorial would make a world of difference. Tutorials that From Software does use in moments both in this game and its others to convey important information to the player. And that leads me into reason number 2, and that's that there are technically tutorials regarding world tendency, but I would argue that they're rather misleading. Remember that section at the back of the Nexus with all the tutorial texts that explain stuff for new players? Well, at the very back, there's a couple of them related to world tendency. The first two cover the difficulty dynamics and explain that the demons are more or less of a threat in pure white or pure black respectively. Okay, that's not a bad start. But what about this other last message? The third and final message states the following, and I quote, "Pay attention to the tendency of the world's souls." That's it. Pay attention, it says. Nothing about how you can influence it, just sort of making it sound like it's something you need to be aware of. In the original version of the game, by the way, this is the entire extent of the explanation of world tendency. That's it. The remake thankfully has an expanded tutorial in the menu, but even that tutorial is guilty of poor wording, saying that world tendency can shift. Can shift? How? Why? What are the implications? They went through the effort of adding this additional tutorial into the remake, but it offers nothing extra in terms of substantive information for players to grasp onto. Normally, I don't like to be that guy that nitpicks individual word choices, but saying stuff like can shift and players should pay attention is about as vague as you could possibly get with these, and for no good reason. And it also says absolutely nothing about what affects world tendency anyway. I can understand how this wording would make sense in the original version of the game somewhat, but it's absolutely bonkers to be in the remake. Why does the difference matter, you might ask? Well, to explain, I'm going to have to go on a bit of a tangent to discuss something called server tendency, which was a unique feature to the original Demon's Souls not carried over into the remake. Now, I can't say exactly for sure how this worked because I don't have any first-hand experience with the original Demon's Souls, but apparently in the original Demon's Souls, world tendency took into account the average world tendency state of all other players on a server in addition to the actions that take place in their own world. As if this stuff wasn't confusing enough already. As you might expect, this extra little wrinkle of how world tendency was calculated was dubbed server tendency, and it could prevent players by reaching certain tendency states such as pure white or pure black if the server averages leaned too far in the other direction, which I imagine was quite frustrating. Like I said, the remake did away with this idea so other players can no longer affect your tendency state, but I actually can't say for sure. All I could find in the terms of official sources was the lead developer saying that world tendency was unchanged, which would lead me to assume that this would be still in the game, but the community seems to be more or less unanimous that it doesn't seem to be a thing anymore, and I haven't seen any instances where my tendency has shifted unexpectedly, so I can only assume that this is true. I'll be discussing more of the implications of this system later actually, but for now I just wanted to explain what it is. My point here is that the tutorial for world tendency usage of can shift and framing it as something that players need to be aware of would be a bit more acceptable in the original since there was an element of essentially RNG that went into it, but it's absolute nonsense wording in the remake because that no longer reflects how the system actually works. It's pretty unfortunate that the tutorial message, which is basically the only thing in the game that directly references this system in the first place, still words the message in such an ambiguous way. It's even more confusing when you compare it to the character tendency tutorial because that tutorial states the following, quote, "The spiritual standing of your character is affected by your choices." The character tendency tutorial makes it very clear that it's a system tied to players' actions, and it distinguishes itself from world tendency specifically with that choice of wording. But why? Why not just use the same or similar wording? Using such distinctly different phrasing makes it sound like these systems work in fundamentally different ways, when that isn't actually the case. The way world tendency is talked about in the tutorials, can shift, pay attention, makes it seem like the player has little to no control over it and just has to be aware of it. And this would seem entirely reasonable based on how these are worded to assume that a person's choice would affect their own moral alignment, aka character tendency, while the world at large has its own ebbs and flows that are beyond one's direct influence. That conclusion would be a logical one given how all this is presented, but it's not how it actually works in practice. Nor do these messages address any of the other implications of world tendency that go beyond just the changes in difficulty. So when all is said and done, players who pay the most attention and study these tutorials are going to come away with, at best, an incomplete understanding of how the system works, and at worst, a total misunderstanding of it because of the lack of detail and weird choice of words, and that's even if they manage to find these few very specific messages in the first place. Think back to 2.1. Remember when the devs put a carefully worded tutorial, 2 of them in fact, because of how vitally important it was that players understood the difference of different damage types in this area? From definitely knows when it needs to provide some additional clear direction for the sake of player experience, and that makes it all the more frustrating when they sometimes just opt not to. I mean, this is almost as bad as the insane description for agility in Dark Souls 2. Anyways, my main point of this long-winded rant is that world tendency as a concept does not communicate itself well enough. I'm not saying the game should give away all of its secrets with a text tutorial, but the way these tutorials are worded is vague at best and completely misleading at worst, and for no good reason whatsoever. Reason number 3. Even on a more fundamental level, even the way this mechanic is conventionally talked about is kind of deceiving. And that's because tendency changes don't take effect until you reload the world using an archstone. A better way to put it would be that triggering a tendency event will put the corresponding tendency changes into a sort of queue. Once you use an archstone to reload the level, then and only then is when all of the queued tendency changes are triggered. Why From Software did not make the changes trigger immediately, or at least trigger some sort of indicator for it like they did with character tendency, is a bit strange. Especially because dying does not trigger these effects either. It has to be an actual teleport to reset the area. So given this, how on earth is anyone meant to figure out what actions are actually making a difference to world tendency? Let me give you an example. Let's say you go to an area for the first time, let's say it's World 4. Presumably you die a bunch to the skeletons. You probably make what seems like a well-reasoned choice to use some of your limited resources of Stones of Ephemeral Eyes to restore your body and give yourself a health boost to try pushing through the level. And maybe that is enough to push through, leaving you with the impression that being human is a massive advantage and you should seek it whenever possible. But let's say you still die another 2, 3, 5 plus times, and at that point you give up. You decide to go back to another world and maybe upgrade your gear before returning. And it'll only be when you suddenly come back to World 4 some nebulous amount of time later where you'll see it suddenly in darkness, and there's all these new difficult phantoms to deal with, you're dying in fewer hits, and you have no idea why any of it happened. Seeing the character tendency symbol change in real time was more than just a simple UI thing. It's one of the major details that helped players see for themselves what actions were affecting their character tendency, and therefore they were able to learn about the mechanic a lot more naturally. Players still had to figure out the effects of character tendency for themselves, but at least they got a nudge in the right direction as opposed to, well, absolutely nothing. Of course, the benefit of it being this way is that players have a chance to sort of correct their mistake if they die in human form. If they're able to get through the level and kill the boss before teleporting out, then they won't have to worry about doing the level over again in a harder state, and that is a great thing to take advantage of once you know about it. Like, I understand why they wouldn't want to have the difficulty increases kick in immediately. In fact, it's one of the only things about world tendency that's mildly forgiving. so I don't take issue with that aspect of it. If you're well stocked on resources, you could just stay in an area and die as many times as it takes, and that is something veterans can definitely exploit to their advantage. But that's only once they know that it works this way. What I don't understand is why there's absolutely no indicator of any sort when a tendency change has been queued. Like, they seriously could have had the best of both worlds here. If there was some sort of visual indicator that would tip players off that something they did, such as dying, had some sort of impact on their world tendency, then when they return to the next time around to see a tendency state that's totally different, they'll have a much better understanding as to why, which could then snowball into players figuring out the basics of the system more naturally. Like, you literally could have just had the world tendency symbol change in real time the same way the character tendency symbol does, but then just not trigger the changes in real time until the level is reloaded, just like it is now. I mean, yeah, it's a 2009 game at the end of the day, but I think it would have been totally fine to build it this way. It's maybe still a little bit confusing, but I think it would have made the system overall much easier to understand without altering any of its actual gameplay effects. So here's the crux of the issue. When you introduce a very complex and intricate system such as world tendency, don't explain it at all, and then provide no immediate feedback to players as they engage with it knowingly or otherwise, you break the sense of cause and effect that these games so often rely upon to teach players things in a way that feels organic. Which leads me to my fourth and final reason that the amount of obscurity surrounding world tendency is a problem. In the examples I gave earlier regarding level design and interacting with patches, players are able to draw a clear cause and effect model in their heads when they open up a shortcut or get tricked by that pesky rascal, because its effects are immediate. Even if they aren't consciously recognizing it at the time, players will make that sort of mental link between the action they took, the consequence, and the lesson it was meant to teach, with that understanding growing ever stronger as the game progresses. It's the same thing that applies to typical gameplay elements such as combat. Even some of the more obscure aspects like good old character tendency followed this principle to some extent thanks to the UI feedback. You might not know exactly why everything happens the way it does, but observant players will catch on to things and make the connection that what they are doing is having some level of effect on their disposition. Over the course of Demon's Souls, players will just learn mechanics like this naturally if they're paying attention, and so as a result, the game doesn't have to resort to excessive tutorials. Showing a clear cause and effect is absolutely essential if the expectation is that players can figure these things out on their own. Because otherwise, even if you know that something exists, you just have a game of trial and error on your hands. With world tendency, you might not run into a unique world event until hours after you've hit the corresponding tendency state. Or the first times you die in human form, you might not fully feel the difficulty increase until all of a sudden you're being swarmed by red phantoms, which of course won't trigger until the next time you reload the level at some nebulous point in the future. I know the first time I saw the extra red phantoms, my assumption is that it was some sort of pseudo-invasion, and these extra phantoms were spawned in by another player trying to kill me. And that's just because I had absolutely nothing else to go on at the time and had never seen this before, despite being fairly deep into the game at the time. I want to emphasize though that the time gap between the actions and their consequences isn't actually the source of the issue, because this sort of thing can be done well. And to demonstrate this, we need look no further than a little game called Baldur's Gate 3. For those of you who may not know, Baldur's Gate 3 is a turn-based fantasy RPG with a heavy focus on narrative choices. It's also very long, with many first playthroughs clocking in at well over 100 hours of playtime, and as a result of this length, some choices won't have resolutions or consequences until hours or even dozens of hours later. I'm not going to be spoiling anything here, but anyone who has played the game will know that there are many examples of this. But despite how long it can take for a choice or action to bear fruit, you'll almost never be confused when that eventual payoff comes around, because the game makes it very clear why things happened and how your actions contributed to the eventual result. This could be done through a familiar face making a return, some unique dialogue, a context clue, or even the narrator just straight up telling you how your earlier actions led to the moment. But regardless of the method, Baldur's Gate doesn't struggle with this despite how long it can take for certain payoffs to be realized. Now obviously Baldur's Gate, being a narrative-focused RPG, is going to be structured very differently from a Souls game. But I use this example to illustrate that having a long time between a decision and its outcome isn't inherently the problem. It's more a matter of when a player finds themselves asking, why is this rubble randomly gone now? Why is there a person here now? Why is there a bridge now? Why is this weird slug thing here now? There's nothing in the game that explicitly links this to world tendency, and players are just as likely to assume that they needed a key, or that there's a hidden path, or that it could be linked to any of the other myriad of obscure complex systems in play at Demon Souls. It doesn't lead to any interesting or emergent gameplay, it simply leads to questions that can only be answered really by going onto Google. And that's because, as far as players are aware, even if they read all the tutorials, they would only be under the vague impression that difficulty is the main thing affected by world tendency because it mentions absolutely nothing else. As a result, figuring out world tendency events organically just becomes a matter of trial and error, seeing what events trigger under every single different tendency state in every single world, instead of it being something that players could figure out and develop an understanding of as they play and improve at the game. And that's once players are even made aware of this stuff anyway. Let's compare this to character tendency for a moment, and character tendency's one major event, the Mephistopheles quest. Yes, this quest is rather hidden and has numerous conditions for it to occur, but it's a quest all about killing NPCs. If you've managed to get yourself into pure black character tendency, then clearly you have no qualms about killing and pillaging others for your own benefit. So many players who do encounter this quest will do so naturally as a result of their playstyle. Once players start engaging with the content, it's very likely they'll realize either consciously or subconsciously that their own actions led them down this path, and that can be quite an immersive sort of experience. It may not be perfect, but it's a hell of a lot more intuitive than figuring out what affects world tendency and all of its disparate world events are. Like, to realistically figure all this stuff out on your own, you would have to just comb through every inch of every single level at the extreme ends of both tendency states to find all the unique events. Which doesn't exactly sound like riveting gameplay to me. Online messages can be used in clever ways to indicate spots where tendency events will happen, and this is very cool, a great example of the community coming together organically to figure this sort of stuff out. But I would argue it's still not quite enough, since access to online is not something everyone will have, especially on the PS5, and there's no guarantee someone will put one of those messages there at the right time anyway. The messages should have been used as a way to supplement a strong world-altering morality system driven by cause and effect, instead of being the only way some players would ever have a chance at stumbling upon some of these things naturally. If world tendency was meant to act as a sort of dynamic karma system reflecting the state of the world, the failure to convey this information to its audience is probably the biggest reason that world tendency as a whole fails to resonate with so many people nowadays. But in the end, we're talking all optional content here. The Souls games have tons of hidden stuff like this, such as Archdragon Peak and the DS1 DLC, that most players realistically would never find on their own. So world events being hidden behind such systems isn't the end of the world, but the same cannot be said for the difficulty. The difficulty being tied to world tendency is a lot more problematic because that's not just optional content that players can ignore, it's an unavoidable aspect that affects core gameplay. Yes, players do get tipped off to it exactly once in the tutorials, but assuming a player even does take note of these, which is no guarantee in itself, The cause and effect relationship is still not presented very clearly, since there's no easy way for players to figure out how to influence tendency one way or another. Yes, the world becoming more demonic as humans die is something that makes sense from a lore perspective, but the effect is completely counterintuitive to what players would expect for a system like this from a gameplay perspective. That was kind of a messy explanation, so let me elaborate. Dying in these games represents two different punishments: the loss of tangible progress within the level and all of your accumulated souls. But it's also a way to communicate that you weren't up to the task of getting through the specific area. It's pretty punishing to die in these games, and for new players, even just making back all that initial progress can represent a pretty daunting task. So why would anyone choose to think that they would get punished even more on top of this by stacking the odds even further against them and making it less likely they'll be able to make it back to just where they were previously, let alone further ahead? Meanwhile, the players who are doing well either through skill or just out of circumstance and not choosing to use their Stones of Ephemeral Eyes will be rewarded with a much easier experience, with neither side having any idea that their experience is being radically altered by systems working in the background. Seeing stuff like this is precisely the reason why many come away with Demon's Souls thinking the game is far harder or far easier than it's probably actually meant to be, because they'll often have no idea that their own playstyle or choices are influencing the level of challenge that they face. Those are the kind of sentiments that breed frustration rather than satisfaction, and likely has resulted in a lot of people giving up on the game prematurely or consulting wikis just to help them push through. This is something that I think never should need to happen, but a lot of time this is how players who are playing totally blind will come to understand world tendency. I personally am a firm believer that you should never have to go outside of any one thing in order to appreciate or enjoy said thing. I love getting invested in games. Worlds that can pull me in and make me get lost in for hours at a time are some of the greatest delights in the medium, and are part of what makes video games so special, and the Souls games are some of the very best at doing that most of the time. So I don't love it when my immersion gets totally shattered and I'm forced to go to outside sources and conduct extensive research to fully understand key aspects of the game that feel like they're supposed to be consistent, as in the level of challenge, one of the things this franchise is most famous for. I feel like From Software probably intended for players at some point in their playthroughs to have this at least click at a high level, but I don't think the game provides enough concrete information to give the average player even a chance at properly understanding it and its implications on their own. If you're one of those people who did, please let me know down below how you did. I'd be genuinely curious what that experience was like, and I do acknowledge that it could be pretty special for the few who were able to achieve this. At the end of the day, it's the difficulty swapping that goes on in the background where I think much of the frustration with this system tends to come from. People aren't that upset about missing some hidden side interactions, but they do get frustrated when the already hard game is inexplicably getting even harder when they're already struggling to begin with. The whole idea of the game being a fair and balanced challenge seemingly gets thrown out the window, and players feel as if they're getting cheated and kicked while they're down just for no reason at all. What makes all of this most upsetting to me is so much of this frustration could have been avoided if the game at least made some effort to convey that playing in human form is a risk/reward mechanic. Like I've said previously, it didn't need to spill all of its secrets, but just a little bit more detail in the tutorials is really all this stuff could have needed. They could even have done it through NPC dialogue, and that could have gone such a long way. I mean, NPCs already act as tutorials for so many of the fundamentals in these games. Why not just slip in a few lines about how losing your body risks attracting even more powerful demons, or something along those lines? That way you keep the cool variable difficulty that world tendency advocates enjoy, and that I will talk about a little bit more later, but you get rid of a lot of the unnecessary frustration that has likely prevented many people from finishing or even properly enjoying the game, all in a way that would be totally natural and aligned with the way the game teaches so many other things anyway. The fact that the remake in particular did nothing to address this, despite it almost certainly being the largest universal complaint about the original, I think is a huge shame, but that is something I will talk more about later. So let's step back for a moment and look at what we have here and what we've discussed so far. When we compare World Tendency to other systems within Demon's Souls and in the genre in general, the approach of just letting players figure stuff out through experiences isn't nearly effective enough for the system because it is extremely obscure and does not provide nearly enough details to convey its importance or its scope. The poorly worded tutorials and the fact that tendency shifts only occur upon a level reload only compound this issue, and it makes it impossible or nearly impossible for an average first-time player to be able to develop a proper understanding of how their actions are having an impact on the world around them. The remake does a slightly better job with its updated UI and the additional in-menu tutorial messages, but as we've discussed, some of these additions almost do more harm than good. Thank goodness that the remake at least ditched server tendency, because with server tendency, even if players did fully understand how the system works, well, they would still find themselves locked out of pure white or black events through no fault on their own, which they would have no way to circumvent other than going offline entirely, which is pretty awful. The server tendency aspect, in my opinion, is a terrible idea even to begin with, because it takes control completely out of the player's hands, with the only way to counter it being to forfeit several other meaningful systems in the process, aka the multiplayer components. So let's just say I'm pretty glad they ditched that. Now, I wish I could say that that was that, and then I could wrap up this whole video here. It's already been going on for quite some time, but unfortunately there's even more issues with World Tendency that I've yet to address beyond just how it's communicated. The reality is the effects of World Tendency, for the most part, just aren't all that interesting. Not nearly interesting enough to have them hidden behind a system that is so obtuse to begin with. Now, I know I'm saying this with the benefit of hindsight, but these kinds of secrets in the Souls games are known for hiding entire boss fights, secret areas, and often some of the series' very best content. Players are incentivized to figure out all these weird puzzles and quests since the content behind them is often so exceptional. Now, to expect Demon's Souls to have the same level of depth as the later games, in terms of how much content it could hide behind its World Tendency events, would not be fair. But let's take a detailed look at what we do get in Demon's Souls once you do finally understand how the World Tendency works, and then we'll break all of those things down. I'm going to be breaking these events down into different categories. So category number 1 would be the exploration events. New areas that open up upon reaching pure white or pure black tendency, and all of the events are as follows. The gate to the execution grounds opens in 1-1, the door to the second floor east in 3-1, the debris near Lord Rydell disappearing in 3-1, the dragons disappearing in 1-1, the ladder leading to the Istarel falling down in 5-1, the rubble leading to the Dragonbone Smasher disappears in 2-3, the bridge leading to the prison key is there in 3-2, the sword Makoto becomes accessible in 4-1, and exclusively for the remake, the Sodden Ring can be found in 3-2 in pure black tendency only. That sounds like a lot, but it becomes immediately less impressive when you really break it all down. The execution grounds in 1-1 starts off by having you fight a few red phantoms and a crystal lizard, and then also has a pretty good armor set, a colorless demon soul, blue knight helm in the remake, and even an additional weapon and armor set are possible if you fight the NPC here. It's a pretty good haul of unique and valuable items despite the zone being fairly small, and I like that they tied the NPC / Black Phantom of World 1 to this area as well to give it a bit more substance and a unique encounter. The colorless demon soul is also extremely valuable, and being one of only 3 that you can find outside of black tendency, making it a very important find too. The Bushwood armor set isn't unique, unfortunately. As far as I'm aware, there are at least 2 other ways to acquire it, but still, it's a decent offering as a side area. The section that gets vacated by the dragons also has some decent loot, including the very useful strength ring, which is useful on almost any build. This change also has a gameplay impact since the dragons not being present allows you to pass through the bridge section of the level unimpeded, which is a huge boon in New Game Plus. So overall, I would say 1.1 does a pretty good job with its side areas. They feel pretty meaningful and provide some unique encounters and strong loot that most players will be able to make use of. You would hope that this would only be the tip of the iceberg and it would only get better from here, but unfortunately these are kind of as good as these optional side areas get. The new areas in 3.1 are more of the same few prison corridors with a handful of mediocre armor and some upgrade materials that I'm honestly unsure if anyone has ever actually used. The ladder in 5.1 looks like it opens up to a new explorable zone, but it's really just a short straight path leading only to the Isterel with nothing else of substance along the way. Admittedly though, the Isterel is a very cool weapon. These secret zones overall just pale in comparison to what we'd see in later games, topping out at maybe 5 or so minutes of content each, but at least some of them offer compelling rewards that can make them worthwhile if the items in question are important to the player's build. The rest of the events in this category are yet another step down, comprised of essentially just a single item that you can grab. Kind of cool if you want the item for your build or for a quest, but otherwise, the Dragonbone Smasher, Makoto's Sword, Special Ring, and the Prison Key in themselves don't offer anything at all in terms of meaningful content to engage with. The idea of the world's layout actually shifting and having specific encounters and rewards only accessible under certain states is genuinely a very cool concept and something that could have made the foundation of an amazing system. In fact, if it were up to me, this is what World Tendency could and should have concentrated on fully, but I'll elaborate more on that towards the end. My point is, discovering all these secrets could have made for some of the game's most memorable moments, akin to discovering Ash Lake in Dark Souls 1 or Archdragon Peak in DS3 or any of the massive secret zones in Elden Ring. Areas with distinct architecture, unique enemies, memorable bosses, strong ambiance, rewarding loot, or all of the above. Despite how cool it can be to find some of these areas the first time, I routinely found myself feeling disappointed in how lackluster all of the content was. Since completing every single level in the game is required to complete Demon Souls, these World Tendency events really do comprise a significant portion of what you could consider this game's side content. Not only is this side content less compelling than other games in the series, even outside of that greater context they aren't all that interesting in their own right, because very little of what they offer is unique aside from the loot drops itself, which they could have just dropped these same items anywhere in the level and no one would have been the wiser. I think there's a conversation to be had about Hidden From Software makes some of its optional content in general, but that's something better suited for another time. Still, I think these World Tendency events go beyond From Software's trademark vagueness when it comes to side content. They're so much harder to access, which makes it all the more disappointing when the areas are so short or the rewards end up being lackluster. The second category of World Tendency events are the NPC quests. These are quests tied to World Tendency, and unfortunately they don't stand out as anything memorable despite having the potential to be the highlight of the whole system. They all tend to go a little something like this. You bump into a hidden NPC, they'll ask for a specific item, usually from the next area. You retrieve said item, bring it back to them, you get a reward, and that's it. Quest complete. The only one that goes anything beyond this is World 3, where freeing Rydell is needed for the extra section of the prison to become accessible, which you can then explore. Selin Vinland in World 5 also gets a few bonus points for being tied directly to another major character and boss fight. It makes the conversation with her feel a little bit more weighty than the others, but even still I can't help but wishing there was a little bit more to her. My problem with these events is obvious and kind of the same thing as what I just talked about. Unless the quest rewards themselves are of interest to you or you're desperate for every possible scrap of lore, there's just not enough incentive to go for any of these, especially considering how much backtracking some of them require. Some of the characters have endearing personalities, but we'll never know for sure because they don't have enough dialogue for us to form any solid connection with them. Bumping into these NPCs organically can certainly make for an intriguing discovery. The only one I actually found on my first playthrough was Satsuki in World 4. I was really excited, thinking I may have found a new NPC to recruit to the Nexus, chat with, maybe have a cool quest with, but nope. He tried to use the item I gave him to kill me, and after a predictably tedious NPC fight, that was it. Hell, Executioner Miranda doesn't even have a quest, it's literally just an NPC PvP fight. These events just feel really undercooked. They could have done a lot by making memorable NPCs with unique quests or the opportunity to recruit them to the Nexus to have further interactions there. Like sure, I understand why they couldn't feasibly implement secret zones on the same scale as later games, but I think these NPCs could have been so much more meaningful with just a little bit more polish and development time. Most of the Souls games have several standout NPCs that are memorable because they have unique and endearing personalities, or because they're tied to some special content that can't be accessed any other way. Even this game has several excellent and memorable NPCs, but unfortunately the white tendency ones aren't among that group, and that is a huge shame. Next up are the primeval demons. Now, first of all, I do think the idea of locking the main source of upgrade materials for the game's most unique gear behind pure black tendency is a clever idea. It forces players out of their comfort zone and makes them brave the more dangerous conditions in search of those critical materials. It creates a sort of risk/reward scenario with all sorts of potential for interesting situations to arise. I suspect the colorless demon souls are the most likely reason many players will choose to venture into pure black once they understand it, which is also of course assuming they know how the upgrade and crafting system works in this game, but that's a whole other can of worms altogether that I'm not even going to get into. Now in theory, this is a very simple matter of finding the primeval demon in each world, killing it and collecting the reward, but there's a couple of points that I still need to make here. First off, these demons are rather lame. They have, as far as I can tell, exactly one attack and they die in like 2 hits. But that's not even the biggest problem. These blob-like things don't even drop the colorless demon souls every single time. In fact, I had one playthrough where I killed 3 in a row with 2 of them dropping nothing, and it had me absolutely baffled. I just don't understand why they don't have a 100% drop rate on these. Why do this for enemies that only spawn once per playthrough and take so much effort to reach? From what I've been able to tell, the real drop rate seems to be somewhere between 80 and 90%, so it's still highly likely that you'll get them, but for being the main source of colorless demon souls that most players will find, I just find it a bit baffling that they wouldn't make these drop every single time. But anyways, I digress. The fourth and final world tendency events are the ones that I consider to be by far the worst, and those are the Black Phantom NPCs. I'm going to try to keep this one short because I could easily launch into a tirade on this, but that's not really the point of this video. The reality is, NPC fights in all of these From Software games are pretty bad. These ones though are by far the worst ones that From has ever designed. They have bloated health pools and their high damage mixed with the pure black difficulty multipliers mean they'll often kill you in a single hit. This leads to long and incredibly tedious fights where you're forced into a defensive stance, slowly whittling away their HP through hit and run tactics or exploiting their AI to backstab or chain parry them to death. They're genuinely some of the hardest and most demanding combat encounters in the game, far harder than most of the bosses, and I could imagine that they are incredibly frustrating if a new player just happened to stumble upon them. Or, if you happen to have a strength weapon, they might just play out like this. So yeah, your experience could vary a little bit with these, but regardless, I wouldn't exactly say that they're very interesting fights because their AI limitations means they aren't quite able to replicate the PvP sort of experience that I think is what From was trying to go for here. I love the idea of having unique and challenging encounters you can take on for the benefit of getting out of Black Tendency, but these are just more of the same mediocre NPC fights that this game already has far too much of, cranked up to 11. And that's not even mentioning some of the insane abilities that these phantoms have that put them on a completely different playing field compared to your player character. None are more egregious than Cell and Vinland being able to not only roll through the muck and move at normal speed, but heal herself seemingly at will, making it almost impossible for melee characters to effectively challenge her if she moves off of that very narrow island you find her on. The idea that these are phantom variants of the white tendency NPCs is a nice detail, but that only serves to make my point that this would be much more impactful if the white tendency NPCs were anything memorable to begin with. So that's the different 4 categories of events, or the way that I've chose to categorize them. The best way I can describe my overall sentiment about them is underwhelmed across the board. A lot of it has to do with just how they're hidden behind such an ambiguous system already, so you would expect that there be at least something cool behind it all. But they're just not quite at the level where I feel like I want to seek out these events for their own sake in almost any playthrough. The events themselves are serviceable and some of them even border on interesting, but for the most part they're just glorified loot drops without enough substance to stand strong on their own. Now I know that many people are probably going to say that my views towards how good the World Tendency events are has been warped by successive games that came after Demon's Souls, and that it's not fair to judge this game based on that hindsight. I will not deny that it's difficult to retroactively put myself in the shoes of what it was like to play this in 2009. That said, it's not technical limitations that prevented having more depth to the NPC interactions. There's no clear reason that primeval demons couldn't have gotten at least a basic moveset to make them somewhat memorable encounters. The new explorable content is probably the aspect that's most affected by my other experiences, but I still maintain that even these could have been a little bit more special had they given this idea much more of the attention and focus when putting this system together. Instead of having World Tendency revolve around a specific idea and pouring a lot of time and effort into making that idea great, they settled for doing a lot of different stuff just okay. It's a classic quantity over quality approach that these games in particular almost never benefit from. Of course, it's still possible to have some interesting experiences with these mechanics once you understand them. For example, at one point I was farming for upgrades and I wanted the Talisman of Beasts from Skirver's Black Phantom, but I also wanted to kill the Primeval Demon in World 2 to get the Colorless Demon Soul. I just so happened to be in the second half of World 2 at the time, so I chose to kill Skirver first. But then to make sure the Primeval Demon didn't disappear, I could not reload the level, since killing the Black Phantom would have reset the World Tendency to neutral. So I ended up having to walk all the way through Stonefang backwards, and it was honestly a really unexpected and somewhat interesting experience doing it that way because I had never done it before, and it was all because of the World Tendency. On the other hand, a player could easily just look at what I described as convoluted, tedious nonsense that's a waste of time, and I would say fair enough. Especially since that whole thing hinges on having this game knowledge that most players will never accrue on their own anyway. Hell, I didn't even know about most of this stuff on my first playthrough, despite often playing in body form, because I never wanted to look anything up. The unfortunate reality is that most players will never have experiences like these based on figuring things out themselves, and even if they did, it would all be still contingent on going for very specific pieces of gear, which was the case even for myself. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be any incentive to engage with these systems in this way, since there's very little about the content itself that is that special. But let's get more positive for a second here, and talk about the difficulty and how it actually plays going from pure white to pure black in terms of the level of challenge. Personally, as many issues as I have with how it's not communicated and how much frustration it can cause, the difficulty modifiers that come with changing the World Tendency is something that I think is actually genuinely great. Once players finally understand how the system works, it really does add something to the gameplay that honestly none of the other From Software games have ever really been able to capture. Once players are made aware about the risks of dying in human form, it adds a lot of tension, since the consequences for dying even just a few times could have a major impact on the playthrough. It adds a very cool risk/reward decision making process that players have to go through once they finally understand it all. Could sacrificing some health be a worthwhile trade-off for the sake of dealing more damage? Is it worth diving into Black Tendency for that colorless demon soul or precious pure stone that I've been missing? Should I go human now or wait till I'm close to the boss fog to reduce my chances of getting invaded? These are the kinds of interesting questions and scenarios that players will start asking themselves, and it's such a cool way to add depth into the gameplay that isn't strictly mechanical. It's kind of unfortunate that I think there's just such a strong meta now of killing yourself in the Nexus after each boss to avoid even the risk of dying in human form that many will simply follow along with that mantra and not deem it worth the hassle. But seriously, if you're looking to spice up your Demon Souls experience, try venturing out in human form every now and then. If you really want to spice up a playthrough, you might just find yourself having some unexpectedly interesting experiences and having to make decisions that you never really thought about before. I also think that the game having some built-in difficulty modifiers offers some great opportunities for veterans to challenge themselves again on consecutive playthroughs, to leverage their additional skills and knowledge to play as a glass cannon that takes advantage of the extra loot drops and additional souls of pure black to build strong characters faster. Meanwhile, new players would naturally gravitate toward white tendency to tilt scales in their favor in a way that makes thematic sense on a first playthrough. It's a bit like how Spirit Ashes are often used in Elden Ring. They provide a helpful boost to ease in newcomers and are often dropped on subsequent playthroughs because the extra help is no longer needed. Now, of course, Elden Ring doesn't purposely hide away the existence of Spirit Ashes from the player, but I digress. The whole idea of variable difficulty is such a boon for replayability. It gives players a chance to have some genuinely different experiences across playthroughs without having to resort to self-imposed level 1 runs or playing the game fists only, though of course stuff like that is still certainly possible too. I find it kind of ironic in a way that this series is so known for having a single consistent difficulty, when in reality the level of challenge in its first ever iteration can actually fluctuate more than the vast majority of games that offer a menu select can. And it's just so disappointing that as it stands now, many players will never get to have experiences like this because they will play through the game not even knowing that the system exists, or just out of frustration will choose not to engage with it. All this is even more painful considering how most of these problems are very fixable and the remake completely missed an opportunity to implement more substantial changes. I mean, sure, I did remove the server tendency mechanic, which I think is strictly for the best, and it did update the UI, though not giving any indication of when a tendency change is queued is a total fumble in my opinion, as we've discussed, and the new tutorials should at a very minimum have accurately reflected how this system works on the whole. The last thing I want to discuss is some simple ideas that I think the game, or better, the remake, could have implemented to help address many of the common complaints regarding world tendency, many of which I have discussed in depth. I'm going to start with what I consider to be the easiest and seemingly most obvious solutions, and work my way up to some that might be arguably a little bit more ambitious or would change the game a little bit too much for some people's liking. Number 1, the single biggest thing that could have alleviated almost all of the frustration with world tendency would have been better tutorials. This is pretty straightforward, that accurately reflected how the world and character tendency works. The remake tried to do this, I guess, but I would argue what it provides for character tendency is the only one that is sufficient. It bungled the additional world tendency tutorials in a way that is quite frustrating. Even if it didn't give a full list of what actions can change tendency, at a minimum this wording should have been cleared up and been made obvious that it is a system influenced by player actions, just like character tendency is, and that there is a risk/reward aspect to playing in human form. It's quite frankly inexcusable that it's as vague as it is, especially when the vagueness surrounding world tendency is almost unanimously considered the most common complaint regarding the original Demon Souls. Number 2. Key NPCs should comment on the state of the world. Not only would this be great from a world building perspective, but it would also provide a way for observant players to draw clearer links between their actions and the world's tendency without having to resort to a tutorial. NPCs already serve as tutorials for several important mechanics already, like I've said, and they talk all the time about how dangerous things are out in the world and the demons and all that. But for some reason they have absolutely nothing to say when you've vanquished all of the demons in a given world and brightened it as much as possible. Nor do they lament that demons have become even more formidable in some areas where so many adventurers have been lost. You could make the argument that some NPCs in the Nexus may not know exactly what's going on outside the walls, but at a minimum the NPCs within each level really would have been a golden opportunity to add some kind of commentary on this stuff. There's a lot to criticize about Sekiro's Dragonrot system, but at least NPCs in that game have some sort of reaction to it that makes it clear what is going on. And it's a shame that Demon's Souls has nothing of the sort for this. This could have gone such a long way to improving players' understanding of the system in a way that is completely organic and unintrusive. I mean, these NPCs already give cleverly worded hints and tips that can help with upcoming levels and bosses. Why not have similar lines that pertain to the literal state of the world? Number 3. There should be an immediate and clear indication whenever a change in tendency is cued. This way players aren't faced with immediate difficulty increases after death, but it would still reflect that the world is gradually becoming darker as one dies or brighter as they kill bosses. It would go a long way to avoid the confusion that comes into players suddenly loading back into a world that is in pure black hours later without any understanding as to why. Number 4. The NPCs that you meet in pure white tendencies should be recruitable in some form, or at least some of them should be. I touched on this already, but these interactions would be so much more meaningful if they had some sort of lasting consequence instead of just being one and done meetups. They could join up with some of the existing factions in the Nexus, maybe clash with them, forcing you to make difficult choices and forge closer relations with them and other NPCs in the process. And number 5, which is admittedly a tall task, but some sort of unique encounters or boss fights. These would go a long way to making the secret zones feel a lot more special and worth exploring. Even if fully fledged boss battles weren't feasible, some unique enemies at least would have gone a long way. And I'm not talking about more NPC fights or more phantom variants of enemies we've already fought 1,000 times, but something totally unique instead. The Primeval Demons barely qualify as an enemy, so I don't count those, but look at something like the Deep Accursed in Dark Souls 3 as a perfect example of what I mean. They aren't a boss, but there's only 2 of them in the game, and they have a very memorable design. I wouldn't even say they're particularly fun to fight, but they certainly leave quite an impression regardless. And it would be great to have something like this in Demon's Souls to give the secret zones something to make them stand out. And that's just 5 ideas. I'm sure there are other potentially even better ones, but there's a lot of ways that this system could have been improved and made a lot less frustrating in the process. These ideas would allow the better aspects of world tendency to shine through, like the variable difficulty and the interesting situations that players might find themselves in when trying to trigger specific events. The fact that the remake went out of its way to identify and fix so many pain points from the original game, but did virtually nothing for world tendency is easily the biggest frustration I have with the remake, considering the system as it stood was already among the most controversial things in the entire game. And with that all out of the way, we have finally come to the end. I apologize for how long and convoluted this got. Writing this definitely made my brain bleed at some point, as did the research. But despite the length, I feel like it was super important to have a thorough discussion on this topic, because I feel like it's such an integral part of the Demon's Souls experience, while also being by far its most divisive quality. I've been negative throughout a lot of this video, but let me be clear. Both world and character tendencies are sensational concepts. Having a game world that varies based on how you play is something I adore and wish more games aimed to create. Most games don't even try to add such a level of variation into the mix because it's so incredibly complicated, and the fact that FromSoft was able to conceptualize and design a system that influences so many different aspects of gameplay on their very first attempt at a game like this is undeniably impressive. I just think that at the end of the day, they were a little bit too ambitious with how much they wanted to implement, that some of it wasn't as fleshed out as it should have been. Instead of wanting to do NPCs, black phantoms, dynamic difficulty, explorable areas, and even more, I think they should have instead focused on 1 or 2 of these aspects and given them the proper time and resources to make something really special and design world tendency specifically around a small but refined set of ideas. For example, how cool would it have been if each world had 2 completely unique secret zones, one for pure black and one for pure white tendency, each with its own distinct design, combat encounters, loot, and atmosphere? What if instead those NPCs were fully fleshed out quest lines that made for memorable story beats throughout the whole game? Or what if they fully embraced the RNG elements of server tendency and had randomized world events that are entirely out of the player's control, forcing them to adopt tactics and improvise to new situations on the fly? Or they could have focused entirely on dynamic difficulty in a way that incorporated even more variables and thus even more possibilities for players to challenge themselves and improve the game's replayability. These are just a few examples of ways they could have made for a system that was a lot more focused but more rewarding to engage with. And I think their desire to push every cool idea they could think of into the game makes the system as a whole come out feeling really undercooked. Quality over quantity is king when it comes to stuff like this, but unfortunately, this is something that From Software has struggled to nail throughout their history. The Bloodborne Chalice dungeons and Elden Ring tunnels and catacombs are other examples of where I think FromSoft gets this balance wrong when it comes to side content. I think it's an indication that they still struggle with this type of smaller scale side content that struggles to live up to the quality of the more handcrafted main areas of their games. But where FromSoft and Bluepoint both really drop the ball is their failure to make players even moderately aware of world tendency as a system is going on in the background. I know there are some Demon's Souls fans that may disagree with me here under the pretense that the mystery is a key aspect of what makes the system intriguing in the first place, but I can't help but feel like there must have been a better balance to be found here, one where the mystery and sense of discovery can be maintained, but without making the system totally inaccessible to new players who haven't read the damn wiki. Demon's Souls and its remake just don't quite get there for me, with this system anyway. There is potential for interesting experiences to stem from world tendency once a player understands it all. However, the amount of investment that is required to actually gain a comprehensive understanding of all of these systems is very high, and will rarely be worth it unless the player is in pursuit of a very specific piece of gear. Many players will simply deem these systems not worth their time, and play through the whole game in soul form to guarantee pure white without engaging with any of its other mechanics. As it stands now, world tendency will go down as one of the great conundrums in FromSoft's modern history. The unique premise is enough to where it often is cited as one of the greatest appeals of Demon's Souls, but its execution also leaves many players feeling confused, frustrated, and underwhelmed in equal measure. Maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but I would genuinely love to see another From Software game, or any game for that matter, take a shot at something like this with the benefit of hindsight, as well as the power of modern technology, and no, the Dragonrot system from Sekiro is not it. I myself am rather skeptical that we'll ever get back to that at this point, but hey, a guy can hope. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. This was my first ever attempt at a more video essay style of content, and it's what I want to be doing a lot more of on here going forward. I'd welcome any feedback regarding the topic, the editing, the commentary, whatever it may be. Any ways that the video could be improved or any things that you like, I would love for you guys to let me know so that I can make the next ones better and improve my editing and all that good stuff. I'm already working on some content for Elden Ring with the upcoming DLC. I have at least 2 video ideas in mind already that I want to do involving that, so and that's less than a month away by the time this video comes out, so I hope you guys are as stoked as I am for that DLC. It's going to be hopefully a really good time, and yeah, there's going to be content here on this channel regarding that in a similar style to this, so I will see you guys then, but until then, hope you guys have a good day, and like I said, any critiques or comments about the video or how to improve it, I would love to hear them. So thanks, and have a good one.